Sometimes, the things we spend our whole life protecting are the very things that keep us lonely. Jonathan Reeves didn't know it yet, but that truth was waiting for him the night he came home too early. 3 days ahead of schedule. That's all it took to change everything. His jet landed in quiet secrecy, his phone silenced, his mind heavy with exhaustion. All he wanted was silence, the kind that made him forget the noise of boardrooms, the lies of men who smiled while plotting his downfall, the emptiness of success that no one dared to question. But as the front door closed behind him, he realized that silence had betrayed him. There it was, the sound of laughter. Small, fragile, like chimes caught in a summer breeze. Children. He froze, his hand still on the doorknob, heart tightening with disbelief. He didn't have children. He didn't even have anyone who dare bring them here. Yet the giggles came again, soft and innocent, echoing through the marble hallway like sunlight spilling into a room long kept dark. His shoes clicked sharply as he walked through the mansion, the kind of rhythm that used to command fear in his meetings. But tonight, it sounded hollow, too loud, too cold. Every step drew him closer to the sound that didn't belong. The walls of his empire, glass, steel, and silence, suddenly felt like they were holding their breath. And then, he saw her. Isabella, his maid. Her back turned as she hummed quietly, the kind of song that feels like home even to strangers. 2 small children clung to her legs, their golden curls glowing under the soft kitchen lights. For a moment, the sight was almost beautiful, like a painting that didn't belong in his perfect, soulless house. Then reality crashed in, swift and merciless. His jaw tightened. Isabella. His voice cracked through the air like thunder. She turned, startled, her face pale, her eyes wide yet steady. Her hands trembled, but she shielded the toddlers as if they were part of her heartbeat. He didn't need to ask. The fury rising in him spoke first. The billionaire who could control markets, crush competitors, command entire empires. And yet, in this moment, he couldn't command the chaos inside his own home. What is this? He demanded, his tone colder than the marble beneath his feet. She swallowed, her voice soft but steady. They're my sister's children. The words trembled like a prayer. She's gone. Their father abandoned them. I had nowhere else to bring them. For a second, silence reclaimed the room. The only sound was the small, unsteady breath of the children and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Jonathan's eyes burned with disbelief. He had rules for a reason, boundaries built to keep emotion out. Compassion had no place in his world. But something about her eyes, weary, desperate, yet defiant, pulled at a corner of his heart he thought had died long ago. He told himself it was anger. It wasn't. It was something quieter, something heavier, something human. He should have fired her instantly. That would have been the old Jonathan Reeves, the man who never hesitated. But as she adjusted the sling around her shoulder and the little hands pressed closer to her chest, something cracked deep within him. He remembered a silence like this one, not peaceful, but empty. A childhood where no one came when he cried. Where love was a word he read in books, not a feeling that ever reached his skin. Now it was here again, love, raw and trembling, standing in his kitchen dressed in a blue uniform and courage. And it terrified him. You deceived me, he said finally, his voice trembling with restraint. You broke trust under my roof. I did, she answered softly, tears glinting but refusing to fall. But I didn't break my promise. I told my sister I'd protect them, even if it cost me everything. The air between them tightened, a war of pride and grief. He wanted to believe she was wrong, that rules mattered more than compassion. Yet in her defiance, he saw something he had lost, the ability to love without fear. For the first time in years, Jonathan couldn't find the words to win. He looked at her again, the woman who dared bring chaos into his kingdom, and felt something unfamiliar stir beneath the weight of his pride. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was admiration. Maybe it was the beginning of something he wasn't ready to name. Because sometimes, the heart breaks quietly, not from loss, but from remembering what it's like to feel again. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, the billionaire and the maid stood in the fragile stillness of 2 worlds colliding, one built on control, the other on love. And though neither knew it yet, their lives had already begun to change. Every love story starts with a moment that feels impossible. This was theirs, the night a man who had everything met the woman who taught him what it meant to have a heart. If this story touched something inside you, take a quiet breath and let it heal you for a moment. Then share your thoughts below, because maybe someone out there needs this story too. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more tales that remind us love is never lost. It's just waiting to be found again. And as the night closed in around Jonathan Reeves, he didn't know yet, but the sound of laughter would become the melody that changed his life forever. The silence after her words stretched like a thread between them, delicate and trembling. Jonathan stood motionless, his shadow long against the marble floor. The ticking of the wall clock became deafening, marking every second he didn't know what to say. Isabella's arms tightened around the children as if she feared he might take them away, and the toddlers, sensing the storm in the room, buried their faces against her chest. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to remind her that rules existed for a reason. His house, his order, his world untouched by the chaos of other people's lives. But the way she held those babies, her body slightly trembling, her lips whispering soft words in Spanish that even he couldn't understand, it disarmed him in ways logic couldn't fight. The melody in her voice was simple, soothing, almost sacred. It reminded him of a memory so faint it hurt. The sound of his mother humming before she left for good. "You think compassion excuses deception?" he muttered, his tone quieter now. He expected her to shrink, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness. Instead, she lifted her gaze and met his eyes with a steady calm. "I don't ask for forgiveness," she said, voice gentle but unwavering. "I only ask you to understand that I had no choice. The world is cruel, Mr. Reeves. And sometimes, the only way to protect the innocent is to break a few rules." The honesty in her voice felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, too bright, too true, too uninvited. Jonathan felt it burn somewhere deep inside, a place that had long been cold. For years, he had believed that power meant control, keeping emotions locked behind iron doors. But here was a woman with nothing but faith and a promise, standing against him without armor. And somehow she looked stronger than he had ever felt. He turned away, rubbing his hand across his face, trying to regain the composure that used to come so easily. "You can't just bring strangers into my home. Do you realize how dangerous this is for you? For them?" His words came out rough, more concern than accusation. She blinked in surprise. "I know," she whispered, "but I couldn't leave them. They are my sister's last heartbeat. Her last prayer." Something inside him shifted again. He didn't want to hear it. Didn't want the ache that came with understanding, but her words slipped under his guard like water finding a crack in stone. He saw the tiny hands clutching at her uniform, the pale hair curling against her shoulder, and for the first time in a very long while, Jonathan Reeves felt something that had no name. The fire in his chest cooled into something gentler. He crossed his arms, not to defend, but to steady himself. 3 days, he said quietly. "You hid them for 3 days." "Yes." Her answer was steady. "Because I was afraid. Not of punishment, but of losing them. I prayed you wouldn't find out so soon. I thought I could fix everything before you returned." "And you thought you could fix it alone?" His voice softened, no longer sharp. She nodded. "That's what women like me do, Mr. Reeves. We fix things alone, because no one else will." Her words struck like truth spoken through years of quiet suffering. He saw it in the tiredness beneath her eyes, the rough skin of her hands, signs of a life built on endurance. He had always measured people by strength in deals, not strength in love. But now he saw a different kind of power, the kind that carried life through pain, the kind that refused to surrender even when the world turned its back. Jonathan exhaled slowly, as though his lungs had forgotten how. The children shifted, one of them lifting a hand toward him, tiny fingers curling in the air. He froze. The small gesture felt like an invitation and an accusation all at once, a reminder that the world outside his wealth still breathed and needed. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, quieter, stripped of arrogance. "What would you have me do, Isabella?" She blinked at him, startled by the change in his tone. "Nothing," she said. "Just let me stay until my mother recovers. Then I'll find a way to care for them on my own." "Your mother, she's sick?" Her lips trembled, the truth finally breaking through the wall of composure. "She fell after the funeral. Her body's weak. She tried to keep the babies herself, but she can barely stand now. I didn't bring them here to disobey you. I brought them because I had no one else." Jonathan felt his chest tighten, an ache that had nothing to do with anger. He remembered all the nights he had come home to silence, how he had mistaken it for peace. He thought he wanted solitude, but now, standing here, he realized solitude was only another word for emptiness. He took a step closer, almost without thinking. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Because men like you don't believe in stories like mine." It was the simplest sentence he had ever heard, and it undid him. In that instant, he saw her not as an employee, but as a woman who had carried grief and love on her back like twin weights, refusing to let either destroy her. And in her bravery, he found a mirror to the loneliness he had been too proud to name. The air between them softened, fragile but alive. The babies stirred, letting out small sighs that filled the silence like a blessing. Jonathan looked at them again, not as intruders, but as lives that demanded care. He turned toward the window, watching the city lights in the distance, the empire he had built brick by brick, deal by deal, and realized how hollow it all looked from here. He had spent years conquering the world, yet knew nothing about saving it. When he finally faced her again, there was no trace of the man who barked orders. Just a man who didn't know how to heal but wanted to try. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all this," he murmured, his words almost lost to the hum of the night. "Maybe," Isabella whispered, "you're not supposed to do anything. Maybe you're just meant to feel." The simplicity of it, that invitation to feel, hit him harder than any accusation ever had. For the first time in years, he didn't try to reason his way out of a moment. He simply stood there, letting the warmth of the small kitchen settle into his bones, the soft scent of milk and soap, the quiet rhythm of breathing that made the mansion feel less like a museum and more like a home. Outside, the wind brushed against the glass walls, carrying the faint sound of rain, gentle, cleansing, alive. Jonathan's gaze lingered on Isabella's face, the faint exhaustion softening her beauty, and he knew something irreversible had begun. There was no explosion, no grand confession, just a quiet shift, the kind that starts small but changes everything. And as the children drifted into sleep, their soft breaths a lullaby in the silence, Jonathan Reeves realized he was no longer angry. He was awake. That night, when he walked away, he didn't return to his office or the study where his empire waited. He went to the window and stood beneath the soft light, letting the storm outside mirror the one inside him. It wasn't peace yet, but it was something gentler, the fragile beginning of it. He didn't know that the next sunrise would bring choices that would test him in ways no deal ever had. For now, all he could do was breathe and let the warmth of this strange, unexpected humanity settle where the cold once lived. And somewhere deep inside, something whispered softly, "This is how healing begins." The morning came softly, the first light of dawn spilling through the tall glass windows like a whisper of forgiveness. Jonathan Reeves hadn't slept. He sat in his leather chair all night, watching the rain smear the world outside into shades of gray. The silence no longer felt like comfort, it felt like confession. Every flicker of the city lights reflected on the glass reminded him of the look in Isabella's eyes the night before. Fear, courage, and something he couldn't name. When he finally rose, the mansion was quiet except for the faint hum of life he hadn't heard in years. The smell of warm milk, the distant murmur of lullabies, the delicate rhythm of small hearts beating under the same roof as his. He walked toward the kitchen, his footsteps softer this time, unsure what he was walking into. Anger, forgiveness, or something in between. Isabella stood by the counter, her back turned to him, sunlight painting her hair in soft gold. The two children were awake now, small and fragile in the early light. One reached for a spoon and dropped it, giggling. The other clapped with joy at the sound. It was such a simple scene, yet it filled the air with something the mansion had never known before, life. He stopped in the doorway, a man who had conquered empires and still didn't know how to walk into this room. For years, his mornings had been filled with silence, coffee, and stock reports. But now there was laughter, fragile and pure, and for reasons he couldn't explain, it unsettled him. Not because it was wrong, but because it was human. "You're awake early," Isabella said without turning around. Her voice was calm, but he could hear the carefulness in it. The fear of saying too much, the attempt to sound normal in a house where nothing felt normal anymore. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on her hands as she poured milk into a small cup, steady despite the exhaustion that lined her shoulders. He could see how tired she was. Every movement spoke of someone who had lived too long in survival mode, yet still carried gentleness like it was her only shield. "I didn't sleep," he finally said. She turned then, her eyes meeting his. There was no accusation in her gaze, no anger. Just quiet understanding, the kind that makes words unnecessary. "Neither did I," she murmured. Her voice was soft, worn but kind. "They woke a few times in the night. The little one has nightmares. Sometimes he calls for his mother." Jonathan's chest tightened. He looked at the boy, so small, his hair tousled, his eyes still swollen from sleep. Something inside him wanted to look away but couldn't. "He calls for someone who's never coming back," he said under his breath. Isabella nodded. "But he doesn't know that yet. And maybe it's better this way for a little while." Her words sank deep, gentle yet heavy. He envied that kind of faith, the belief that love could protect even in loss. For him, love had always been a transaction, given only when safe, withheld when it hurt. She placed a cup on the table and motioned toward a second. "Would you like some coffee?" He almost refused, out of habit. But something in her tone, simple, human, healing, made him pause. "Yes," he said finally, and it felt strange, that single word. Like accepting peace for the first time in years. They sat opposite each other, the table between them too large for comfort, yet too small to hide from the truth. The air was still, but not tense, just waiting. Jonathan studied her quietly. The light touched her skin like warmth made visible, and he found himself thinking she didn't look like a maid anymore. She looked like someone carrying an entire world in her arms. "Why didn't you go to your family?" he asked after a long pause. "Surely someone could help you." Her smile was small, tired. "Family doesn't always mean help, Mr. Reeves. Sometimes it's just a word people use to hide the distance between them." He stared at her, feeling that truth cut close. "I know that feeling," he said quietly. Her gaze lifted, curious. "Do you?" He hesitated, but the question lingered in the air like an open door. "My parents loved business more than people," he said slowly. "They built this empire and forgot to build a home. I learned early that love can be taken away the moment you need it most." Isabella's expression softened, her eyes glimmering with compassion. "Maybe that's why you protect your silence so much," she said. "Because silence never leaves." The words slipped past his defenses, striking something tender. For a long time, he didn't speak. He just watched her feed the children, the rhythm of her care almost like prayer, each spoonful, each soft word, each smile she didn't even realize she gave. He thought about his house, every inch perfect, lifeless, untouched, and how easily she'd filled it with warmth without even trying. The sight of her there made him realize something he'd never allowed himself to see, how lonely his perfection truly was. "You shouldn't have to do all this alone," he said finally. "I'll arrange help for your mother. Medical care, whatever she needs. And as for the children." She stopped him, shaking her head gently. "You don't owe us anything, Mr. Reeves. You've already been kind enough not to send us away." "It's not about owing," he said firmly. "It's about doing what's right." His voice carried a weight that made her pause. For a man who'd spent his life making deals, these were the first words that sounded like they came from his heart. The children giggled again, breaking the tension. The little boy reached across the table and grabbed Jonathan's finger. It was such a small gesture, just a curious child's trust, but it felt like a crack in a wall that had stood too long. Jonathan didn't pull away. He simply watched that tiny hand holding his, and the world seemed to slow. For the first time in years, something felt pure, uncalculated. He couldn't name it, but he knew it mattered. When Isabella looked at him again, there was no distance in her eyes, only warmth. "You don't have to understand everything right now," she said softly. "Sometimes, just being here is enough." He nodded, feeling the truth of it sink into his bones. It wasn't grand or dramatic. It was quiet, gentle, and real, the kind of truth that doesn't shout but heals. Outside, sunlight began to spill across the garden, lighting the room in gold. The air felt different now, lighter, almost peaceful. Jonathan Reeves, a man who had spent his life chasing power, found himself simply sitting still, watching life unfold in front of him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether she'd stay, whether he'd have the courage to let her, but at that moment, none of it mattered. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about what he'd lost or what he might gain. He was just present. And in that quiet morning, surrounded by laughter and the fragile rhythm of healing, something inside him whispered softly that perhaps the heart, too, can find its way home. The mansion, once a place of echoing footsteps and empty halls, now carried the faint hum of life again. And though he would never say it aloud, Jonathan Reeves knew this was the beginning of something he could no longer ignore, the slow, beautiful undoing of loneliness. As the morning sun warmed his face, he realized that some changes don't come with thunder. They come with a child's laughter, a woman's quiet courage, and the soft grace of forgiveness that asks for nothing, yet gives everything. That evening, the sky bled into shades of amber and rose, the kind of twilight that softened even the sharpest edges of the world. Jonathan stood by the tall window of his study, watching the fading light stretch across the garden. He used to love this hour, the stillness between business calls, the calm before another restless night. But tonight, the silence carried a strange ache. It wasn't the emptiness he'd known all his life. It was something gentler, something alive, like the quiet after a confession. The sound of faint laughter drifted through the corridor. Not the hollow kind he heard at galas or dinners with investors, but real laughter, fragile, pure, like sunlight caught in motion. He found himself drawn to it before he realized he was moving. His steps took him toward the kitchen again, though he told himself he had no reason to go. He could have stayed in his office, surrounded by the comfort of control. Yet something stronger than habit pulled him closer. He stopped at the doorway. Isabella was sitting on the floor, her blue uniform slightly creased, her hair pulled loose from a long day. The two children were beside her, building tiny towers out of wooden blocks that must have been hidden away in some forgotten corner of the house. Each time the tower fell, one of them gasped, the other clapped, and she laughed, the sound warm and full, the kind of laugh that made the air around it feel lighter. Jonathan leaned against the doorframe, silent. For years, he had filled this house with art and furniture that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Yet none of it had ever made the place feel as alive as this one quiet moment. The laughter of two children, the soft rhythm of Isabella's voice, the faint hum of an evening settling in. It all came together like a melody written for a heart learning how to beat again. He didn't speak. He just watched. The way she gently wiped a crumb from the child's chin. The way her hands moved, graceful, careful, kind. There was something healing about her presence, a kind of peace that didn't ask for permission. When she finally noticed him, she didn't startle. She looked up slowly, her expression unreadable at first, then softened into something like quiet understanding. "They wouldn't sleep," she said, her tone apologetic but tender. "I thought maybe playing would tire them out." He nodded, his voice low. "You don't have to explain." The children noticed him then, curious eyes, tiny smiles. One of them reached for him with small, trusting fingers. He hesitated, unsure what to do. He had faced hostile investors and manipulative rivals without blinking. But the touch of a child's hand suddenly felt like the most terrifying thing in the world. And yet, when those fingers wrapped around his, small and warm, something inside him gave way. Isabella smiled faintly. "They like you." He didn't answer, but a flicker of warmth rose in his chest, fragile and disorienting. He sat down on the floor beside them, awkwardly at first, then with more ease than he expected. The marble felt cold under him, but their laughter was enough to make it disappear. "You're not what I expected," she said quietly after a while, as she stacked another block. "What did you expect?" he asked, his voice softer than he meant. "A man who only sees rules and walls. But maybe I was wrong." He looked at her then, truly looked. "You weren't wrong," he said. "Maybe I just got tired of being that man." The tower between them swayed and fell, scattering blocks across the floor. The children squealed in delight, and Isabella laughed again, that same sound that had haunted him since morning. Jonathan found himself smiling before he could stop it. For a long moment, time slowed. The sunset filtered through the curtains, painting everything in gold. It was so peaceful that even the ache in his chest began to ease, replaced by something almost like belonging. He hadn't realized how much he missed this. Not just company, but the quiet safety of being seen without judgment. The world he'd built had been made of perfection and pride, but this chaos of toys and laughter and unpolished humanity, it was real. When the children finally grew tired, Isabella carried them to the couch. humming softly as their eyelids fluttered shut. Jonathan helped without words, bringing a blanket, adjusting a pillow, moving with the careful grace of a man afraid to break something fragile. "They trust you," she whispered. He paused, the words catching him off guard. "They shouldn't. I'm not." He trailed off, unsure how to finish. "Maybe trust doesn't ask who deserves it," she said. "Maybe it just knows who needs it." Her words settled into him like warm rain. He stood there, watching her as she tucked the children in. The sight filled the room with a gentle holiness, a simple act of care that made everything else in his life seem small. He wanted to thank her, to say something worthy of the moment, but the right words refused to come. Instead, he said quietly, "You should rest. I'll make sure everything's taken care of tomorrow. Your mother, the doctor, whatever you need." Isabella turned, surprise flickering in her eyes. "You don't have to." "I know," he interrupted, his voice steady. "But I want to." There was a pause, soft and heavy. She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable but tender. "Thank you." He gave a small nod, then looked at the children again. Their tiny chests rose and fell in sleep, their faces peaceful, untouched by the world's cruelty. The sight stirred something deep in him, a quiet realization that not all battles were meant to be fought in boardrooms. Some were meant to be fought in silence, for the sake of love itself. When Isabella turned to leave, her shoulder brushed against his arm. The touch was light, accidental, but it lingered. He caught the faint scent of soap and milk and something softer, something that reminded him of home, though he hadn't had one in years. As she disappeared down the hallway, he stood there for a while longer, watching the slow rise and fall of the children's breathing. He didn't know when the house had changed, but it had. The walls no longer echoed emptiness. The air no longer felt sterile. There was warmth here now, fragile, uncertain, but real. He walked back to his study, but the numbers on his desk meant nothing. The files, the deals, the wealth, all of it blurred in his vision. For the first time, he realized how little any of it mattered. Because tonight, for a few quiet moments, he had seen what it meant to be human again. The night grew still. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and jasmine. Inside, his heart began to unlearn its armor, piece by piece. And as he sat there, the sound of distant laughter lingering like a memory, Jonathan Reeves knew that something irreversible had begun, the kind of change that doesn't make noise, only peace. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the warmth settle into the cold places of his soul, as the healing light of evening faded into the promise of a new dawn. The afternoon sun lingered low, turning the mansion's long hallways into rivers of gold. Jonathan had spent hours pacing between his study and the garden, his mind unable to settle. Work waited for him, calls, contracts, the machine of his empire, but for the first time, none of it mattered. The world outside his walls could collapse, and he wouldn't have noticed. All that seemed real was the echo of soft laughter still floating through the air, the trace of Isabella's voice humming somewhere distant, gentle and alive. He walked outside to clear his thoughts, but peace didn't come. The garden, immaculate and vast, felt too orderly, too silent. The roses stood in perfect lines, trimmed by hands paid to maintain beauty, yet they carried no soul. He looked toward the kitchen window instead. Inside, Isabella moved quietly, her silhouette framed by light, the two children sitting on the counter, waving spoons like small wands of joy. The sight was simple, ordinary, and it disarmed him more than any storm ever could. He remembered his father's words, "Never let emotion cloud judgment." Those words had built his fortune, but now they felt like a curse. Because here he was, unable to think straight, undone by something as human as warmth. It wasn't weakness, though, it was awakening. He went back inside, the sound of his steps softer than usual. Isabella turned at the noise, startled but not afraid. The light hit her face, just right, soft, golden, kind. "I thought you were working," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I tried," he said simply, "but it seems I've forgotten how." Her lips curved, a quiet smile that said more than words ever could. "Then maybe it's time to remember something else instead." "What do you mean?" he asked, though he already knew. "Sometimes," she said, "we spend so long surviving that we forget how to live." He leaned against the counter, eyes never leaving hers. "And what does living look like to you, Isabella?" She hesitated, glancing at the children before answering. It looks like keeping promises, even when they cost you everything. It looks like laughter, even in places where you once felt nothing. It's small things, Mr. Reeves. Making soup for someone, wiping tears from a child's cheek, remembering that kindness still matters. He was quiet, her words stirring something deep, something sacred. You speak like you've lived 1,000 lives, he murmured. I've lived one, she replied softly. But I've had to start over more times than I can count. The children laughed then, breaking the moment's stillness. One of them held out a spoon toward Jonathan, a silent invitation to join their world. Without thinking, he reached for it. The boy giggled, delighted, as if he'd handed him a crown. Isabella's smile deepened. You see, she said, you're already learning. He chuckled under his breath, though it came out shaky, uncertain. I don't even know what I'm doing. Maybe that's the point, she said. Maybe for once, you don't have to know. The words felt like healing disguised as truth. He sat down on the edge of the table, awkward but oddly comfortable, watching her feed the children with a gentleness that quieted every restless thought in him. Do you miss her? He asked after a long silence. Your sister. Isabella's hands stilled for a moment. She nodded slowly. Every day? Sometimes I hear her laugh when the children sleep. It's strange how love doesn't die with people. It just changes its shape. Now it lives in their eyes, in the way they cling to me when they're scared. I can't let that go. Jonathan listened, the ache in his chest growing softer, like an old wound beginning to close. You've kept your promise, he said quietly. Not yet, she whispered. Keeping a promise means seeing it through to the end. Her words hung in the air, fragile and powerful all at once. He looked at her, realizing how much strength could hide behind gentleness. She wasn't just a woman surviving. She was a soul carrying light through darkness, and somehow, that light was beginning to reach him too. When one of the children yawned, she lifted the little girl and carried her toward the couch. Jonathan followed without a word. She laid the child down, tucking the blanket with care. The boy watched, his eyelids fluttering. Jonathan crouched beside him, unsure what to do, then did the simplest thing. He placed a hand on the boy's hair, smoothing it gently. The child sighed and leaned into the touch. Isabella's gaze softened. You're good with them, she said quietly. He almost laughed at that. No one's ever said that to me before. Then maybe they never looked closely enough. Her voice was low, soothing, filled with something that felt like faith. He looked up at her, and for a moment, the world outside disappeared. There was no billionaire, no maid, no difference in power or place. Only two people bound by something unspoken and deeply human. The lamp light brushed across her face, highlighting the traces of fatigue beneath her beauty, and he found himself wanting to ease it. You should rest, he said softly. You look tired. I am, she admitted, but I'm afraid if I stop moving, I'll start feeling everything at once. He understood more than he could say. Then let me help you carry some of it. Her eyes glistened, and for a moment, neither spoke. The space between them felt charged, not with desire, but with compassion, that rarest form of connection that doesn't demand anything, only gives. She smiled faintly, whispering, Thank you, Jonathan. Hearing his name on her lips for the first time sent something warm through him, quiet and steady. He wanted to tell her that she didn't have to thank him, that she had already given him more than she knew, reminding him what being human felt like, but he couldn't find the words. He stood there instead, the soft glow of the room wrapping around them like a blanket. Outside, the world had begun to rain again, the drops tapping gently against the windows. The sound was calming, almost like a heartbeat. The children slept, the air smelled faintly of milk and soap, and the house no longer felt empty. It felt healed. Jonathan looked around, realizing that for years he had filled his life with everything money could buy, but had forgotten to fill it with what mattered. And here, in the quiet presence of one woman and two small souls, he found what he hadn't even known he was missing. When Isabella finally excused herself to rest, he didn't stop her. He just stood there, listening to her footsteps fade into the hallway. Then he turned back toward the sleeping children, the corners of his lips curving into something rare, a smile unforced, unplanned, honest. He sat near them for a long time, not as a billionaire guarding his domain, but as a man remembering the sound of peace. His reflection in the window no longer looked cold or untouchable. It looked alive. The rain kept falling, steady and rhythmic, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to chase anything. He let the stillness hold him, let the warmth of that small moment seep into his bones. The world outside could wait. Tonight, this was enough. The fragile, imperfect beauty of a heart beginning to heal. And though he couldn't yet name it, deep within him, a quiet truth was forming. One that whispered of second chances, of grace found in the smallest acts of love, and of how sometimes the greatest transformations begin not with thunder, but with the simple, steady sound of rain. The days that followed passed like soft waves, each one quieter, gentler than the last. The house that had once felt like a monument to loneliness now carried the rhythm of life, small, delicate, but steady. Morning sunlight found new corners to warm. The air smelled faintly of soap and coffee instead of polished marble. Jonathan Reeves began to notice things he had never cared to see before. The way the curtains moved when the wind passed, the sound of tiny feet running in the hall, the whisper of laughter echoing faintly like music. It wasn't chaos. It was healing disguised as ordinary life. He would wake earlier than usual, drawn by the hum of the kitchen. Isabella was always there, moving quietly, her hair tied back, her sleeves rolled up. Sometimes the children would be perched on the counter, eyes still heavy with sleep, reaching for her hands as she poured milk into their cups. The mornings felt softer now. The house no longer demanded silence. It breathed. Jonathan found himself slowing down, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He stayed longer at breakfast. He listened when Isabella spoke about her mother's recovery, about the children's small milestones. Her words were simple, but they carried warmth that filled the empty spaces in him. He had never realized how starved he'd been for gentleness until she gave it so freely, without asking for anything in return. One morning, when the twins had been taken for a walk by the nurse he'd arranged for Isabella's mother, he found her alone on the back porch. The sunlight touched her skin like a quiet blessing. She sat with her legs folded beneath her, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her face relaxed in a way he hadn't seen before. He hesitated in the doorway, uncertain if he should disturb the moment. But she looked up and smiled. "You're allowed to sit, you know," she said softly. He smiled back, taking the seat beside her. "I'm still learning how." "Then start here," she said. "Start with the quiet." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't feel empty. Birds moved through the garden, their songs weaving into the stillness. The breeze carried the scent of lavender and rain-soaked earth. Jonathan felt his chest loosen, not with excitement, but with something far deeper, the slow exhale of a man who had forgotten how to rest. "I used to think quiet was the reward," he said after a while, his gaze fixed on the garden. "That if I worked hard enough, controlled everything, I could finally earn peace. But it turns out peace doesn't come from control." Isabella glanced at him, her eyes thoughtful. "No," she said gently. "Peace comes when you stop fighting everything, even yourself." Her words felt like a soft touch to a wound he had ignored for too long. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, he didn't see just a maid, or an employee, or even the woman who had challenged him. He saw someone who had survived grief without letting it turn her cold. Someone who carried love as both a burden and a gift, and who still found the courage to smile. "I think I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of feeling too much, of needing anyone." "Needing people isn't weakness," she said. "It's proof that your heart still works." He almost laughed at that, but the sound caught in his throat. He wasn't sure when her words had begun to reach him this deeply, but they did. They sank into him, quiet and healing, like light through water. They talked a little longer, about nothing and everything. About how the twins were learning new words. About the way her mother smiled now when the nurse arrived. About the smell of fresh bread that reminded her of her childhood home. Each word built a bridge between their worlds, plank by plank, until there was no longer a distance to cross. As the sun rose higher, Isabella stood to go inside. "You should eat," she said softly. "I made breakfast." He nodded, following her back in. The children were there again, laughing as they tried to feed each other. Their giggles filled the kitchen like wind chimes. Jonathan found himself laughing too, quietly at first, then with ease. The sound surprised him, and Isabella's eyes flickered with warmth when she heard it. "You look different when you smile," she said. "So do you," he replied. Their gazes met for a moment too long, a breath suspended between them. It wasn't romantic yet, not in the way stories usually are. It was gentler, the kind of affection that grows quietly, the kind that feels like safety. Later that day, Jonathan found himself in his study, but the documents before him refused to hold his attention. His thoughts kept drifting, to the kitchen, to the sound of children's laughter, to the way Isabella had said his name once in passing, soft as a prayer. He realized then that something had shifted permanently. The fortress he had built around himself no longer felt like protection. It felt like a cage. That evening, he went to check on her. She was folding laundry by the fire, her movements slow and rhythmic, the children asleep nearby. The room glowed with golden warmth. She looked up when he entered, startled but calm. "You work too much," he said quietly. She smiled. "So do you." He sat across from her. "Maybe that's why we understand each other." Her laughter was soft, but it lingered. Maybe. Or maybe we're both just trying to find something we lost a long time ago. He washed her hands as she folded a small blanket. "And what is it you're trying to find?" She paused, her eyes distant. "Peace. The kind that doesn't depend on things staying perfect." Jonathan nodded slowly, his heart tightening around the truth of it. "I think I've been searching for the same thing." They didn't need to say more. The room held its own conversation. The flicker of firelight, the rhythm of her hands, the slow, steady sound of their breathing. Everything felt suspended, balanced between quiet and meaning. He reached forward then, hesitantly, picking up a folded blanket. Their fingers brushed, and time seemed to still. Her touch was soft, grounding. It wasn't electric, wasn't the kind of passion that burns, it was the kind that heals. She didn't pull away, but she didn't move closer either. She just looked at him, her eyes reflecting something unspoken. Trust, maybe, or recognition. He didn't need to define it. It was enough to feel it. When she finally rose, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You're changing, Mr. Reeves." He met her gaze, his tone low and sincere. "Maybe I'm just remembering who I was before I forgot how to feel." She smiled, a sad, gentle smile that reached her eyes. "Then that's a good thing." He watched her walk away, her steps light, her presence lingering like warmth after sunlight fades. The house felt quiet again, but it wasn't the cold kind of quiet anymore. It was peace, the fragile, living kind that only comes after years of silence. Jonathan stayed by the fire long after she left, thinking of everything he'd built and everything he'd lost chasing perfection. Somewhere in the steady flicker of light, he found a truth he couldn't escape, that all the power in the world meant nothing without someone to share warmth with. Outside, the night deepened, but the darkness didn't frighten him anymore. It felt gentle, almost comforting, like a blanket laid over an exhausted heart. He leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the faint sound of rain against the windows. He didn't know where this path would lead, whether it was love, redemption, or simply the slow rediscovery of himself. But for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid to follow it. The fire crackled softly, wrapping him in its glow. Somewhere in the quiet house, Isabella's lullaby drifted faintly through the walls, and Jonathan Reeves let himself smile, not because he had everything, but because, at last, he had begun to feel again. The morning after the rain carried a softness that felt almost unreal, as though the entire world had exhaled. The air was clean, filled with the scent of wet earth and blooming gardenias. Jonathan Reeves stood by the window, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the sunlight stretch across the damp grass. It had been weeks since he'd returned home early, weeks since the sound of laughter had found its way into his house, and yet each day still surprised him. He wasn't used to waking to warmth, to gentle noise, to the quiet rhythm of life that expected nothing from him except presence. Downstairs, Isabella's voice rose in a hum, the same tune she often sang to calm the children. He'd grown to recognize it before the words even formed. Low, healing, familiar. The song seemed to carry through the halls like a blessing, reaching the lonely corners of his mansion that hadn't felt alive in years. He followed it, drawn not by curiosity, but by the simple peace it gave him. When he entered the kitchen, the twins were sitting at the table, their fingers sticky with jam, giggling at some private joke only children could understand. Isabella stood near the stove, her hair a little messy, her face flushed from the warmth. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, surprise flickering briefly before her expression softened into something steady. "You're up early," she said, handing him a plate without waiting for an answer. He accepted it, smiling faintly. Habit. She laughed lightly. You're getting better at breaking those. He glanced around the room. Sunlight spilling across the counter, the smell of bread and sugar, the sound of little feet against the floor, and realized she was right. Every routine he'd lived by was slowly dissolving into something gentler. He wasn't resisting anymore. The children finished eating and clambered down from their chairs, tugging at Isabella's hands. Outside, one of them asked, eyes bright. Just for a bit, she said, looking at Jonathan for silent permission. He nodded. I'll come with you. She blinked, as though she hadn't expected him to say that. You? I could use the air, he said, reaching for his coat. The garden was still damp, the earth soft underfoot. The twins darted across the grass, chasing butterflies that fluttered through the sunlight. Isabella followed slowly, her hands trailing across the tops of flowers. Jonathan walked beside her, quieter than usual, but his silence was no longer the cold kind. It was peaceful. They like it here, she said softly. So do you, he replied. She looked up at him, a smile touching her lips. I suppose I do. It feels safe. He nodded, though something inside him tightened at the word. It should always be safe for you here. There was sincerity in his tone that surprised even him. Isabella looked at him for a long moment, then turned her gaze toward the children. Thank you, she said simply, but the words carried more weight than he expected. They watched the twins play, the sun warming their faces. Jonathan had attended galas in Venice, dinners with presidents, nights on yachts that glittered under foreign stars. Yet nothing had ever felt as real as this. The laughter of children, the soft brush of wind, the quiet companionship of a woman who didn't need to impress him. He turned toward her, his voice low. You've changed this place. Isabella glanced at him, her brow furrowed. This place? My home, he said, then hesitated, correcting himself. My life. For a heartbeat, she said nothing. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that carried understanding instead of pride. Maybe it was always waiting to be changed, she whispered. Her words found their way into the hollow parts of him. He thought of how empty his days had been before her laughter began filling them. He thought of how silence used to comfort him, but now, it only reminded him of what he'd nearly lost, the chance to feel something real. The twins ran back, breathless and glowing. One tripped, scraping a knee, and burst into tears. Isabella immediately knelt, her hands gentle and sure as she soothed the child. Jonathan watched her, the tenderness in her voice, the steady rhythm of her care. Without thinking, he crouched beside her, taking the small bandage she offered. He pressed it carefully over the scrape, his touch uncertain but soft. The child sniffled once, then smiled. There, Isabella said. See, it's all better now. Jonathan smiled too, though the warmth in his chest had nothing to do with pride. It was something deeper, a quiet gratitude for being allowed to witness love in its purest form. When the children ran off again, Isabella stayed kneeling for a moment, her gaze fixed on the earth. I used to believe life only gave and took without mercy, she said softly. But lately, I think it gives back, just differently than we expect. Jonathan looked at her, the breeze lifting a strand of hair across her face. And what has it given you back? She met his eyes. Peace, she said. Not because everything's easy, just because I've stopped fighting what I can't change. He wanted to tell her that she wasn't the only one finding peace here, that her presence had softened every corner of his life. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he reached out, brushing the loose strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was light, hesitant, but she didn't pull away. Her eyes met his, calm, warm, endless. The world seemed to still around them. The sound of children laughing faded into the distance, replaced by the steady hum of wind through the garden. There was no need for words. Everything they wanted to say existed in that one quiet moment. He stepped back first, unsure if it was courage or fear that made him do it. You should rest later, he said gently. You've done enough for today. She smiled faintly. You always say that, but I don't think I've done enough until they're asleep. Then at least let me help, he said. She laughed softly. Help? You? Stranger things have happened, he said, his tone light, but his eyes soft. By evening, the house was filled again with the gentle chaos of life, the clatter of dishes, the soft hum of bedtime songs. Jonathan helped her wash the plates, their hands brushing once, then again. The air between them was quiet but charged, not with tension, but with the fragile beauty of two hearts learning to trust again. When the children finally fell asleep, Isabella lingered by the door, her voice low. "You've done more than you think, Jonathan. They're safe. My mother's healing. And I'm learning to breathe again." He met her gaze, his own voice barely above a whisper. "Then maybe we're both healing." Her eyes glimmered at that, soft and alive. "Maybe we are." She turned to leave, but something in him refused to let the moment end. "Isabella," he said quietly. She stopped. "You've done more than change this house. You've reminded me what it feels like to have something worth protecting." She looked at him for a long, silent moment. Then she smiled, and that smile, simple, kind, utterly real, became the most beautiful thing he had seen in years. When she was gone, he stood alone for a while, his reflection caught in the window. The man staring back at him didn't look like the one who'd come home that night. Hardened, cold, unreachable. This man was different. His eyes carried warmth. His posture, humility. His heart, a quiet pulse of gratitude. Outside, the night wrapped around the house like a promise. The stars hung low and clear, and for the first time, Jonathan Reeves didn't wish for more. He didn't crave noise, control, or victory. He simply stood there, feeling the fragile peace of a life gently rearranging itself around love. And as the light faded, he knew this was no longer just Isabella's story, it was theirs. Two broken souls who had found in each other not perfection, but healing. The kind that stays, the kind that whispers, the kind that lasts. The following week unfolded like the last chapter of a quiet miracle. The storm that had once lived inside Jonathan Reeves had stilled, leaving behind a peace so gentle it almost frightened him. His days no longer revolved around meetings or markets, but around laughter that spilled down the marble halls and the soft voice of a woman who spoke truth without fear. The mansion had stopped being a fortress. It had become something far rarer, a home. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Jonathan stood at the balcony overlooking the garden. The children were chasing fireflies, their small hands glowing with wonder. Isabella sat nearby on the old stone bench, her dress brushing against the grass, the golden light painting her skin in warmth. It was such a simple scene, yet it felt sacred, like watching life heal itself in slow motion. He watched her quietly, his heart calm in a way it had never been. The air smelled of lavender and rain-soaked soil. The breeze carried the laughter of the children like music. He had spent his whole life chasing power, thinking peace would come after success. But peace, he had learned, wasn't something to win. It was something to allow. It bloomed only when the heart finally stopped fighting. Isabella looked up at him, catching his gaze. "You're quiet," she said, smiling softly. "I'm learning," he replied. "To be quiet? To listen," he said. "To the world. To people. To what matters." She nodded, her eyes kind. "That's a good lesson to learn." He sat beside her on the bench, close enough to feel her warmth, but far enough to still breathe. The garden shimmered with dusk. The children ran to them, their small hands full of glowing insects, their laughter bright as bells. He caught one in his palm, careful not to crush it, and released it into the air. The light floated upward, disappearing into the sky. "They trust you," Isabella whispered. He turned to her, his voice soft. "Do you?" Her gaze lingered on him. "I think I always did," she said, "even when I didn't want to." The honesty in her voice wrapped around him like something holy. He didn't reach for her hand, though he wanted to. Instead, he said quietly, "You've given this place more than I ever could. You've given it heart." "You did that yourself," she said gently. "You just needed to remember how." Her words settled deep, like seeds finding soil. He realized then how love isn't always born in grand gestures. It grows in silence, in forgiveness, in small acts of care that ask for nothing in return. The children climbed into Isabella's lap, their laughter fading into yawns. She kissed the top of their heads, and he watched the way her eyes softened when she looked at them. Something about it stirred him in a place beyond reason. The way she carried love so effortlessly, as if it were the only thing that truly mattered. When she finally met his eyes again, he saw everything he'd been afraid to admit. He needed her not as a savior, but as a mirror to his own humanity. In her presence, he remembered that even broken hearts can learn to beat differently, slower, steadier, fuller. He whispered, I used to think love was something that made you lose control. Now I think it's what helps you finally let go." She smiled, that soft, healing kind of smile that seemed to forgive the entire world. "Maybe love isn't about control or surrender," she said. "Maybe it's just about being brave enough to stay." The words lingered in the quiet. The sky deepened to violet, the first stars blooming above them. The children fell asleep in her arms. Jonathan reached forward, gently taking one of their blankets and tucking it around them. His fingers brushed hers, a brief touch, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He looked at her, his eyes warm. "No, Isabella. Thank you." They sat in silence after that, side by side as the night unfolded around them. The garden lights flickered to life, and for the first time in his life, Jonathan didn't feel like a man defined by what he owned. He felt like a man who had finally found what he had spent a lifetime missing: connection, compassion, the quiet truth that love's greatest power is to heal what we never thought could be mended. When the stars grew brighter, he turned to her again. "You once said peace comes when you stop fighting everything," he murmured. "Maybe that's what this is. Maybe I've stopped fighting." Isabella's gaze softened. "Then hold on to it," she said, "because peace doesn't stay by force. It stays when it's welcomed." He nodded slowly, and in the golden hush between them, he felt something inside him settle completely. The loneliness that had once filled every corner of his life had been replaced by something infinite and quiet. It wasn't the thunder of passion, it was the gentle rhythm of belonging. He looked at her one last time before the children stirred in her arms. "You know," he said softly, "I think I've finally learned what real wealth is." Her brow lifted slightly, curious. "It's not in money or power," he said, his tone low but sure. "It's in the lives you choose not to walk away from." Her eyes glistened, tears she didn't try to hide. "Then you're richer than you've ever been," she whispered. And maybe she was right. Because in that moment, under the blanket of stars, surrounded by laughter that had finally come home, Jonathan Reeves felt complete. The night carried on quietly. The lights from the house shimmered through the windows, and the world seemed softer somehow, touched by grace. Jonathan stood and looked toward the horizon where the city lights met the sky, knowing he would never see it the same way again. The walls that once protected him now stood as reminders of what he'd overcome, proof that even stone hearts can learn to feel again. He turned back to Isabella, her silhouette framed by the glow of the lantern, and thought, this is where life begins. Not in power, not in perfection, but in presence, in the simple act of choosing love over pride, kindness over control, faith over fear. The children stirred, whispering sleepily. Isabella smiled, brushing their hair aside. Jonathan took one last glance at them all, and a quiet gratitude rose in his chest, a prayer without words. He whispered to the night, "May this never fade." And as the stars blinked above, it felt like the universe whispered back, "It won't." If this story brought a little warmth to your heart, take a breath and hold it there for a moment. Let it remind you that even in a world full of noise, there's still room for gentleness, for redemption, for love that asks for nothing but presence. If it touched you, leave your thoughts below. I'd love to know how it made you feel. And if it healed something quiet inside you, don't forget to like this story, subscribe, and share it so it might reach another heart that needs light tonight. May peace find you, wherever you are. May love stay, softly, like a candle that never burns out.